talk about interface, because why not?
We could. I probably don't remember even a single professional term about interface, but
Oh
I
no!
can do them.
I had to look them up today. Actually, the pronunciation, because I couldn't really skeuomorphic. Jess, is that right?
Oh, I
Skeuomorphic.
always forget that
What does
word,
that mean?
literally.
Skeuomorphic interface means an interface that you don't see that it's integrated with the game, so that the player knows and the main character knows as well, like Dead Space, basically. That's
I
a
will do
skeuomorphic interface.
I'm so glad that we didn't start and that we're not live, because my definition of skeuomorphic would be different.
It's fine. I mean, I'm already recording, so it's fine.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Well,
I am looking for an answer to this question on the internet.
That's what I wrote in the article. So if it's wrong, I'm going to be pissed.
I actually already wrote it wrong in the Google search, so I started awesomely. Because as far as I know, it's also an inspiration from reality, which moved to games. It means that you don't distinguish it, but maybe I'm wrong, because in my historical career with UIs, I saw when skeuomorphism became popular, and I was like, fuck no, and moved on. So
So yeah, I mean, we'll leave it to Damiano when he wants to start whatever.
yes, so if someone wants to talk about skeuomorphism, it's up to him. And then we sneakily say, Damiano, could you write it, please? How is it pronounced?
Can you spell it? No, I can't.
Can you spell it?
SK what? Okay.
Okay.
So we're here with Daniele, who is actually I have to do the presentation first. Fuck. We have to do the whole hello. This is
we don't do that. We never do that.
We don't do that anymore.
No.
See, I know shit. Yeah, that's us being professional. Sure. Yeah. Okay, so we're here with Daniele. He's a bit of a interface expert, the god of interface. So he knows anything and everything. And well, yeah. Actually, yeah. Jokes aside, I'm curious to talk about Daniele because he's been working on interface, and yeah, he knows a bit on how all this interface thing works. And yeah, I've written recently an article, but yeah, I'm still trying to discover what it's all about. So Daniele, let's start with very simple things, I would say. What are some of your favorite interfaces, but in games, whatever you can think of?
You already start with the difficult questions. I thought we were friends.
You could say, who are you? What do you do?
No. I will answer that like Dark Souls. No, I'm joking. But I don't really. Okay, I should really think long about it. But I like. Okay, I reveal before starting this conversation, we didn't record that. I hope, but we were talking about skeuomorphism, and in a way, this is connected to that. Damiano will spell it for us later, and. I do actually love interfaces that are part of games. And for example, Papers, Please, which is basically a game based on the whole game is an interface. And I love what Nier Automata did with it. I don't know if you played it, but there is this, basically the interface changes all the time, but also it develops with the game. At the beginning, you have a part of the interface, then you progress and they give you another part of the interface. And I loved that so much. And in general, I love the fact that where the games where interfaces are considered a game in itself or a part of the narrative, etc. I really dislike games where they're a separate object and it's like, okay, we have this piece of the game, this other piece of the game. But in general, I like games that mix stuff well, even if if you're doing an RTS, it's necessary to have a certain type of interface, and so it needs to be more detached from the rest. But in general, I like them playful. I like them to do fascinating stuff. For example, Persona, which is, in my opinion, is not a great interface from a UX point of view, but from a design point of view, it's brilliant, and it's been I saw it as an inspiration for tons of stuff. And it's brilliant also because it's very simple if you think about it. Like it's based on very simple design practices that simply hadn't been really used into game interfaces before, which goes to show that there's still so much stuff that we can do with interfaces and things like that. Did we put a counter on how many times each of us says interfaces in this talk? Then we drink when we reach 10.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be an idea. I don't know if you saw some weeks ago. I did like a poll or sorts on Twitter, like people tell me what are some of your favorite interface and less favorite interface.
Oh,
To my not really much of my surprise, but yeah, a lot of people said that their favorite kind of interface is that the one that is transparent, so not really skeuomorphic, but yeah, something even more generic as the games with no interface, basically. And this is something that you would think that it's kind of a recent thing because some people were name dropping Shadow of the Colossus or Echo, but it's not really that recent because even if you go back to Another World, Out of This World, from 1991, the game has no interface. So basically,
yes.
Everything you do in the game, even the only thing you pick up is basically the pistol. You can see how much ammo it has from a kind of lead on the pistol, something like that.
But that was wild at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not really a new idea, though. I mean, it took a lot of time for developers to start using it, of course, in a lot of games. But still, it's not really a new idea. But the question I'm going to ask is this: would you say that is the best kind of interface? I mean, the best idea to develop an interface?
Well,
like,
fuck no. I mean, no interface is not the best interface. Like,
Yeah, really.
I can understand freeing the screen from interface. I actually like it because when it's not necessary, let's not use it. Why should it be there? But it's just a way of saying it's ugly. Let's not show it. So there is a problem there. And so I think that no, it's not my favorite kind of interface, even if I appreciate the fact that it's missing sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Jesse, what are some of your favorite interfaces? You've been sitting in the dark.
Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't even. I didn't even think of any, and then you brought up Persona, which is actually a really that annoys me from a UX point of view. There's so many menus, but it's so stylish that it almost doesn't matter. And yeah, Nier Automata, as it just uses it in a really good way as it brings it in, to kind of tell the story of the game as well over time. So those, I'm just gonna parrot what you said and say those.
As long as you agree with me, I'm happy.
Exactly.
Also, we must say, since we talked about Persona, we both said that the UX, we don't really appreciate it. But that's also, we have to specify that it's a cultural issue also, because from a Japanese point of view, it's more of a Japanese interface. And so it's just because of our culture that we're more used to other types of interfaces. It's not that it's bad. We can't really perceive all the difference that we would otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
all that, yeah.
And speaking of RPGs, I was lots of people also on Twitter talked about the Elder Scrolls series, and going back to both Arena and Daggerfall, they didn't really do anything special with the interface because it's basically just Dungeon Master and a bit of course simplified because Dungeon Master was quite old at the time. But yeah, it's basically the same thing. Just the screens with inventory and the character screen, and remove the stuff, pick up the stuff from the ground, put it on the character. Yeah, basically stuff that we've seen a million times. But Morrowind did something different, which was interesting because you haven't seen it anymore in other Elder Scrolls games. In that, Morrowind used a kind of Windows-like interface, so you had each window for inventory in the character screen and blah blah blah, spells, whatever. But you could customize each window. You could modify the size. You could delete it even if you didn't need it. Like for example, if you're a warrior, you don't need, of course, for example, the spell book, a list of spells. And yeah, that was interesting. And naturally they had to basically give up that system by the time Oblivion came out, because Oblivion was thought to have to work on different systems, while Morrowind was just thought to work on the PC. So of course, from then on, Elder Scrolls became a series that would be developed for consoles. So naturally, it didn't make sense for Morrowind to be, the one kind of interface that they would recycle for other games as well. But I think there was something, lost there, of course, because as long, and this is something that I wanted to ask to you, Daniele. As long as you if you let the user interact with your interface to their likings, so customize and modify it, then I think it's always something that it's worth having options. What do you think?
I think that it depends. It depends both on the type of game and on the period. For example, for Morrowind, it made sense because it was like a historical period where we were more accustomed to Windows, etc. And an interface like that was also, as far as I can remember, wildly original, that you could resize the windows, etc. I don't always agree that it's a cool thing. Like personally, I love if you give me Windows to resize, etc. I love that, but that's because I have a fetish and it's my problem. But in general, when you allow too much customization, often it means that your interface doesn't have a great personality, and you're not so sure of it, and you say, okay, let the user deal with it. And so, yes, you're giving more freedom, but there's a level of insecurity that I don't fully appreciate. So, and it doesn't work on obviously, even if we're not just talking about Windows size, once you move it on other platforms, it doesn't work. One also could say that rarely an interface can stay the same on all platforms. You always have to change something, but still. By the way, I would like to know how it's interesting talking about Elder Scrolls, for example, after how Elder Scrolls manages to have a good interface just because of the mods. Because I don't know if you remember, but when it came out, everybody was hating on the UX and on the UI because it had some pretty blatant I don't want to say mistakes, because I can understand why some decisions were made. And again, making a UI for a game like that with all the people involved in the decisions, also it's super complicated. So nobody's at fault for that. But it became so much better thanks to mods. And that was interesting. I always liked it.
Yeah, well, I've also just recently played a little bit of Daggerfall, which was released on Steam recently, and on Daggerfall Unity. So I installed like 3-4 mods, and yeah, there's lots of stuff, and it's incredible. It really makes it a different game. Of course, it doesn't fix a lot of the problems. It fixes the interface, it fixes the graphics, the map system, which was terrible in the original Daggerfall. But yeah, it doesn't fix all the problems. So, for example, the interaction with the NPC is still pretty terrible. That is something that they haven't really fixed even later Elder Scrolls games. But yeah, we're getting a bit off topic.
But for the time it was, I mean, I don't remember that so well because my memory is horrible, but for the time it was super cool. Or wasn't it?
Well, you already had the Ultima series, which was similar in that respect, in that there were a lot of NPCs you could interact with, but they all said the same thing, basically. So it was basically just a repetition of, sprites that all will tell the same thing. And but Daggerfall had something different in that you had the moods system, that you could ask the same question in different three moods, like polite, neutral, and aggressive. Yeah. And the fun thing is that I put a screenshot on Twitter, is that the reactions to that kind of tone are totally random. For example, you ask a question politely and the NPC says, "Why don't you learn some manners?" Then you ask it neutrally and the NPC gets angry. Then you ask it angrily and the NPC says, "Well, I don't know what to tell you." So it's a bit random. So yeah, I mean, good ideas, but...
Maybe it's on purpose and it's trying to create a narrative about that.
But I mean, you mentioned Elder Scrolls, right? So what did you both think of Skyrim? Because that was quite a different UI. where you had all the lists and the side-by-side lists and things when you went in the menus.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, that I meant when I was talking about the UI that became so much better thanks to the mods about Skyrim. And that was like the classicest UI ever, and which again, it's complicated not to do something that is not classic for a game like that. But I mean, the mods showed that even that could be improved so much. So, okay.
But personally, I didn't like it at all. Frankly, the interface in Skyrim, it was one of the main reasons why I probably played it like a couple of hours, 3 hours, then I gave up. Went back. I don't even remember where I played it.
Yeah, but AAA are like slowly trying to do more interesting things with UI. But again, there's so many pieces, so many people involved that it's really complicated to do that. We're a little spoiled because instead in the indie scene we can do kind of what the fuck we want with it because there's so less stuff to control. We can be wild, etc. We don't have 30 bosses above us that tell us no, the other tells maybe, the others tell go home, and things like that.
But when we talked, Danielle, about interface, you said something that I liked. I also put it in the article, which was the difference between designing an interface for an application versus designing an interface for a game, which are two completely separate experiences. You want to go into it a bit? I mean, why are these two different experiences?
Can you remind me what I said?
well, you said that the way that you design program developer designs an interface for an application is because it has to function, it has to be useful, it has to describe what the application does in detail. So it doesn't have to be pretty, it doesn't have to be, what we mentioned, that like stylish or anything. It has to
I cannot have said that it does not have to be pretty. That is not who I am.
We didn't get into it, but yeah, I don't know. It doesn't have to. I mean, it can be, but it doesn't have to. But while for a game, for example, you said that a gamer doesn't have like half an hour to learn what the interface does. For example, like in Photoshop, there's like 1,000 options, and it's okay. I mean, it's not like anyone is asking, no, let's take away the options because we don't like it. But with a game, you wouldn't want that. You wouldn't want like a list of things that the interface does, the game does, and that would be confusing and waste of time, right?
But which, in a way, also is like, if you think about it, complex softwares, for example, like not Photoshop, but like any other software, has a very complicated interfaces that have a complicated type of learning, which actually is not that complicated because we have grown accustomed to it. So they all respect some specific rules, and going from one to the other, unless it's the first versions of Blender where everything is crazy, is rather easy. While instead in games, it's in a way less complicated, but it's way more complicated to deliver it because unless you do things in the classic way, like interfaces that are made of Windows, etc., which often happens with RPGs. RPGs are a classic example of repetition through the ages. Then you're always trying to do something new, but yes, like you have to do something new, but don't without boring the spectator who is directly involved. But a trick, for example, sometimes if you do something more complex, is to make it into a game, like Nier Automata did, speaking of AAA, where they give you pieces of UI little by little, and it's not a tutorial, it's really a size of game. It's also interesting, I think, that a big difference is that applications have literally, I try not to say literally, but I will say it this time, literally zero narrative, while instead a UI in a game can have a ton of narrative. Often it doesn't, but it can, and that's a huge difference. Plus, obviously, the controls. Like you cannot rely on the fact that everybody has a mouse, or you also have a much greater attention to usability. Yeah, even if it depends on the game. So yeah, so in a way, like it's like the difference between I don't know. I was making a bad example. I will not say it, but
Well, I mean, what makes a good video game UI? Because I've never really thought about it before. But then when you just brought up those examples, I was like, oh yeah, actually that is true. So I mean, how do you know what is actually a good thing to do? But
You're
if
not
I don't
getting
even
angry.
know.
that yeah, like there are two ways to know if a UI is good as someone that perceives it. One is that you have no idea that it's there, so it does not annoy you. That's why working on UI and UX is one of the most unrewarding jobs in the industry, because if you do it well, nobody gives a fuck about what you did. And but there are some exceptions when instead it's so, let's say, original and interesting that instead it becomes it gets out of its own relegated world, let's say, and it becomes an independent thing. And in that case, you notice it, but it's so incredibly rare. And often, when a UI does that, then the UX is better. So it's a really difficult balance, but I absolutely believe that you can do both. So, but most of all, it's the not invisibility, but perceived invisibility that does a good UI.
Mhm.
Even if I don't like UI that is invisible, like I try to do something else, but
Mhm.
yeah.
I was thinking of an interesting example that marries a bit of the topics that we've been talking about, a bit of the narrative, a bit of the customization, a bit of the way that it interfaces with the player. And I don't know if any of you have played it. It's sort of like a very light RPG, like sort of a mobile game, but it's supposed to be played on a PC, which is Kingsway. I don't know if you're familiar with it at
Oh
all.
wait, I think I know what you're talking about, but I'm not so sure
Yeah,
what you
I will
said.
explain it. It's this kind of fake, like early Windows RPG, in that you have to. It's kind of a very basic RPG at heart, and that you're basically using a fake operating system, and you're
Yeah,
playing this kind of early RPG, like early 90s RPG, and the combat is also made with specific windows that pop up. So, for example, when the combat gets harder, for example, the windows that you have to click to attack start to scroll across the windows, or it gets across the screen, sorry, so it gets harder to click on them. Yeah, I think it does something really interesting with the way that it does a lot of the older things that we've been talking about. It does a little bit of a skeuomorphic in that it makes it's like a real interface. So it's like an operating system in a way. Then it does a little bit of the narrative because the interface is, as the game gets harder, it also becomes more difficult to control. Yeah, so it's a good example, and it's a very simple game. So again, you don't need to do anything grandiose to make an interesting kind of.
yes, but that is, I think, also slightly different because I remember the game. I haven't played it, but it looks super interesting. But in that case, it's not that you have the game and the interface, and both are a game and have a narrative, but the game is like, in a way, Papers, Please. The game is literally the interface. So,
Exactly.
uh,
Hmm. And speaking about the narrative, I have to make an example which I always make, going back to 1988, and this was a very weird French
say
game.
it, say it.
So no one has played it, of course. And it's Captain Blood, which was developed by Air Informatique, which would later become Cryo Interactive. And basically, you play as this Captain Blood, so the self-proclaimed Captain Blood, which is a sort of guy that has to go around space destroying all of his clones. Yeah, it's a kind of a complicated story, so we'll make it short.
The first picture that came out when I typed Captain Blood game has nudity. Is that why you played it as a
No,
kid?
I don't think that's. I don't think that's the one. I don't remember any unit. So yeah, but what you're going around and interacting with several alien races, and the way the interface is developed is that it's
Alien racists.
not racists,
Or
races,
races. Oh.
races. Yes, that would be a different.
It would
Maybe,
be a good game.
maybe more interesting. Maybe more interesting.
Yeah, probably more interesting as a critique.
Yeah,
Oh.
that's There's this very weird interface made up of buttons that you don't know what they do. So the very strange icon buttons because the game.
The one with nudity. Then I don't know how you forgot about it.
Oh, I forgot about the nudity. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah. So it's made of all these weird icons, and you use the icons to interact with the alien races, and you don't know what each button does. And that's on purpose because you need to learn how to communicate with these strange beings. So it makes sense that the interface is so alien to you as well. So you're basically learning as you go together with the main character. So
in the hope that if you learn the language, they will not be racists anymore.
Or maybe they will take off their clothes. I don't know if you said nudity, so maybe we have. So the game could be, instead of Captain Blood, could be called Nude Alien Racists from Space.
I would say to stay in the team, let's take off our clothes now.
Yeah, it could be done. Yes, I mean that would get at least some views. I mean, finally you get the episode with the most views, or maybe the lowest. I don't know.
Yeah, it depends how that pans out.
Maybe a peek and then okay, bye.
Yeah, probably I would say so. Yes. Okay. Then enough about Captain Blood. I think we got.
No, I'm sorry that I interrupted you a lot. I am very evil about it. Please.
No. But that was it basically. It's an interesting other way that you can do narrative and also have a kind of skeuomorphic interface in that it's real for the character, but it's real for the player as well. So it's basically the same interface for both character and player, which was a nice idea. And going actually to modern times, there's the
which for you is 1998.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, actually something funny that usually when I say something like, "Oh, this came out recently," then I go and look at it as 12 years ago.
Yeah.
Then, well, it's kind of recent.
Yeah.
That happens to me all the fucking time. That probably means I'm old.
I'm turning on a light.
Okay, that would be great for the audio listeners. Yes. Okay, Daniel has turned on the light. So everyone
yes, making a lot of noise while doing it.
Yes, everyone is now aware of it. And I actually forgot what I was saying, so that's great. Yes, I was saying going to recent times, so not 12 years ago, but more recent, I would say. There's the game that Xavier Nelson Jr. has worked on, which is, I hope I'm remembering the title right, Space Warlord Trade or Simulator.
Yes.
I'm probably forgetting Organ. Yes, I'm forgetting Organ. Thank you. And he had an interesting reply to a lot of people that were complaining about the interface not having shortcuts or being a little not really ergonomic in a way. And he said that was done on purpose because you don't, as a designer, you don't really need to make an interface that is ergonomic or that it's usable for the player if you don't really plan on doing so. I mean, if it's intentional that you don't want.
If the fatigue is voluntary.
Yeah. And what do you think about this? What do you think about making the player suffer through an interface? How can it make sense? What do you think?
I like the idea a lot. I'm trying to think of who else did it, what other game, but I can't think of any example right now. But I think it's a lovely idea. If it works and if it creates a narrative of hardship via the interface, then it's great, as long as it really has a meaning, and that meaning must be narrative, even if it's just a direct narrative between the interface and the player. So yes, that's narrative. I like that.
That actually reminded me of I can't remember the name, but Damiano, you the game Jay Tholen made.
Hypnospace Outlaw.
Yeah, where it's completely just like a Windows 95 for the whole game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was my comment. I mean, that was it, really.
It's a good comment.
Well, funny thing, I actually asked him about how he went to design the interface, because I mentioned to him that, if you want to make an interface that looks like a 90s website, there are a lot of things that would not work. There are a lot of things that would not really make sense. And he said that as opposed to this idea that we just talked about of making the player suffer, he thought of a balance between the real thing from the 90s and something that would be fun to play, something to be fun to interact with. So he made a kind of balance, compromise. So that's what he said.
But that I can understand. Like again, like I love the idea of making the player suffer via the interface if it has a meaning. But unless it really needs to have a meaning, otherwise it's just empty torture, and that's never fun unless you're into it. But
okay, so I remember something that the interfaces that are integral part of the gameplay are not called skeuomorphic, but are called diegetic. So if everyone has listened to the podcast until now, I made up my mistake. So we got to the right term.
Please say that I said that I was confused at the beginning.
Yes, you're right. Yes. I had to check it earlier. Yes, instead of waiting like half an hour. But yeah, okay.
Now you have to spell both, though.
Well, diegetic is easy. It's like diet,
Start with the
So yeah, let's recap. So diegetic is the interface that is part of the gameplay that both the main character and the player are aware of it. And skeuomorphic is what Daniele said.
You have no idea. Yeah.
It's an interface.
That reminds you of familiar elements, and so it's inspired by things that are not other interfaces.
So King's Way that I mentioned it is skeuomorphic, while Captain Blood was more diegetic.
It's a very stretched example, I think, because it's inspired from a real thing that is in itself an interface, but it's not a normal interface, so it could be both in a way.
So it's meta-diegetic or meta-skeuomorphic.
I think we could invent a word now, like it's craftic. No, Kafkian. Let's just say that it's Kafkian, and let's move on. When we don't understand something, it's Kafkian. We didn't invent it, obviously.
Let's do Kafkiamorphic. So
Kafkiamorphic.
No one knows how it's spelled, so it's
Kafkiamorphic. Though I would say absolutely not as an offense to Kafka, but being respectful to what he wrote about, it's probably a very depressing interface.
That makes sense. But we were talking about making the player makes it connects. It definitely makes.
Now I'm thinking of a way to make an interface that makes a player cry. But not of pain or of frustration, but like because this interface is so dramatic. It would be an interesting thing to think of. It could be a gem.
You mentioned something else about interface that, of course, is interesting, that because we talk about the narrative and blah blah blah. But an interface has still to be accessible, so that everyone, even those who have problems, seeing correctly or everything else, that they can use it correctly. So, what would you say are the most interesting points that you would recommend while designing an interface and making it accessible for as many people as possible?
My most interesting point absolutely would be to open your browser, go to Google and type best ways to make interface accessible, because now people are talking about, so there are so many ways, but and if you want to do it seriously. Also, I'm sorry that I said Google. That's not the only search engine that exists. So just search engine.
We want that Google money. Yeah.
I hate that we always say Google when we talk about search. I mean, that.
Go to Google and search other search engines rather than Google.
I use DuckDuckGo. Then it doesn't work and I go back to Google. But I always try with DuckDuckGo.
Same here. Yes.
And so what was the question? I forgot.
How to make an interface accessible, except going on Google.
Like I love that it became such a prominent theme more and more, because, for example, I think around 8 years ago, it was already a big thing to realize that some people saw colors differently. And obviously it's not that there is only one different way of seeing colors, there are so many. And so people were starting to get involved in that, but now it became more and more the topic is more wide. And so you also have to consider that possibly everything that you do, obviously it depends on the game, but possibly should be controlled with a single hand, possibly not using all the fingers, that there should be accessibility options so that if there are fast reactions that you need to do in the game, you can make that slower, or you can use an alternative control method. The more you let the users customize their control system, also the better it is, because they can move stuff from left to right, group everything on one side. And character size, also font size, has become exactly. And there's these are the, I'm probably forgetting something, but these are the basics, and then you can go deeper. And obviously there are things that I consider secondary because they involve lighter problems, but they're still important. So, for example, things like the head bobbing that can make some people puke, or can or the flashing. Actually, the flashing lights. Let's talk about the flashing lights, because there's lots of games and movies and series that say beware there are flashing lights, so they might give you you know the exactly, they might give you seizures. And there is a very simple solution to that. Don't fucking use flashing lights. Like, I always think like, okay, there might be a situation where from an artistical and authorial point of view, you really need the flashing light. I understand that. But all the other situations when it just adds nothing, simply don't. and so on. But there are a lot of details that are problematic for one reason or the other.
Yeah, because
I remember.
no, go ahead.
No, I remember, for example, there was okay, a thing that really annoyed me, and I can say that I will feel free to speak not badly about a game, but badly about a part of the game because it's a super successful game. So I feel free. The Witness. That there is at a certain point to solve the final puzzles, you have the to solve a puzzle while the screen flashes, and I don't suffer from seizures, but still I had a headache for the whole day because that impressed in my eyes, and that's me. I assume that there must have been people that had even worse problems, and so that annoyed me so much because it didn't add anything to the puzzle itself, but it was purposefully trying to hurt me. I also think that that was kind of done on purpose, like they really wanted to hurt the player, but that's another matter. So yeah, that's the worst example of that I ever saw. And you couldn't skip it, otherwise you couldn't finish the game.
Well, yeah, there are a couple cases I can remember where the flashing lights made sense. For example, I don't know, an action scene in disco or something like that, where it's all, you know, very cut in a way that it looks.
Yeah, but disco, for example, again, I'm exaggerating because basically it became more and more prominent lately for some reason. Right? Like, what gives seizures normally is the flashing of white and black, white and black. You can do also a red flashing, which would be problematic for some people still, but for a smaller number of people. And you can do this for a little while, it's annoying, etc. So again, better not, but why the white, even if you're in a discotheque? Okay, now I'm focusing on something that is not important anymore. I was just thinking about this yesterday.
Something else that you also said, and I think it's a great point to take into consideration while designing an interface, is that you said the designers, the developer has to remember that at least 30% of its users are dumb, are idiots, so that, you know, while designing an interface, you don't have to just keep in mind that it works for you. It doesn't have to work for you personally as a developer, designer, whatever, but it has to work for your target audience. So that target audience is usually also made up of 30% of idiots, you mentioned. So
yes, and I want to say that with idiots, like what I'm saying specifically is I consider myself an idiot. So it's and is that are people that are not used to that. Like for example, my mother was a complete idiot with anything that was computer wise, and so that simply means like that. I know with romance, so we use that word in a different way, but I want to explain that we're not using it in the with you. It's like Uh, I can't think of the English. Okay, I can think of the English word. So idiots, yes, and you have to worry about that because there's lots of people that are not used to that kind of interface or that kind of game, or that maybe are playing that for the first time, which might also be old people, which might also be that finally someone of your family decided to play one of your games. Will never happen to me, but I assume that there are devs that have this experience in their life, and. Uh, and so it's you can't assume that the person that you have in front knows how have some uh, pre I hate English sometimes have some notions already ingrained in their minds. And this is important also from I think it's what makes pop art in a way. Like it's it because interfaces should be popular too, because they should be able to talk to everyone. And so that's the same as pop art. That's the same as with a narrative or with a painting to be able to reach everyone. And maybe you will reach someone else more. Maybe someone will need more time, but you have to capture them immediately. And that's a very important first step.
Mhm. Well, because I don't think it is possible to design something that could reach everyone. What do you think? I mean, 100% of people out there, is it possible?
No, but there, okay, it's that's an interesting point, and yes and no. Like you can reach everyone, but you can't really reach inside everyone.
Mm.
So yes, it's
Right.
like in Indiana Jones when you take the heart and go, oh, what a funny thing. But you have to try, in my opinion. Also, because not just for interface, but with everything. Okay, no. I said a bad thing. You do not have to try. It's nice if you want to try. Sometimes you just don't want. Again, it's the larger problem of, for example, do I want to make a game that can help fascists understand that they're fucking assholes? Or do I want to make a game that just does not have fascists at all trying to play it? Like one might be educative, the other will not, but it's both are valid.
Right. So I think the
And
the the point is that there's not one type of person that's going to play the game, right? Like you could be like never played a game before. You might be experienced. You might be a fascist. You might not be a fascist.
yeah, and but also with interface, there's this point that it's not just the interface that has to capture the player, regardless of their culture, etc. You always can rely on the game. So maybe sometimes you know that your interface will be more ostic. Is ostic an English word?
No,
No, it's
I
I
think
don't.
Italian. Huh?
I don't think so.
Okay,
Okay, let's say hard to decipher.
hard to decipher,
Okay.
and but you can rely on an interesting and appealing game under. So you know, okay, with this thing, players will give me a little more leeway, and I will have more time. So there is this
Sorry.
connection. Yes.
The giggles are back. The giggles are back for the first
Yeah,
time.
we're back to the old time because Daniele, Jesse had this. Well, guests were talking for no reason at all. We would start laughing randomly and would go on for like 5 minutes. Yeah, it
I
happens.
I like that very much. Now I'm happy to be on this podcast.
Finally, at the end,
Yes.
almost at the end, is finally beyond the.
Uh,
Yes, that's great.
mhm.
um,
And
so
also, you
yes,
can I say another thing? Like, for
sure.
example, I have this passion we were talking before. Let's say Persona, which has this wild interface that is not usual, but then the UX, at least for us, is not that nice. But I have a predilection for trying to do wild interfaces. even if I don't always do that, but I try at least a little. And even there, that's another way to capture the player, because maybe your interface is complicated, but if you make it wild enough, they will be fascinated by it. And so again, that's a way to have them give you a little more leeway and a little more time to make them better persons.
How can interfaces make persons better? How can they improve people? Let's talk about.
Yes, and it's very simple because it's no, I'm not going to say it.
Okay. No, I thought you wanted to make a game that asked you, are you a fascist? And the two answer are no, and there's no yes, and you can't escape the game. So.
And if you try to quit, it destroys the computer.
Exactly. So, yeah, that would be an interface that teaches you something.
Well, that just teaches them to lie.
Yeah, but come on. Okay, we're getting into some weird territory here. Okay, one last thing that you mentioned is that if you're doing an indie game, so you don't have to be successful, so you don't have to make money, so you don't have to make people above you happy, so you're just making a small indie game, even for yourself.
You hope to make a little money, but that
yeah, of course, yes. But if you're making a kind of small game that you should always strive to break your dogmas, to go beyond what has already been done, and in all case, always be ambitious. You said.
Oh yeah, you saw my slides.
I studied, baby. I mean, not enough, but I studied.
Yes, no, that's a thing that I always say, but in everything, not just with interfaces. Like again, we all know this. Like games are such a barely born media, and there's still so much stuff to discover, to explore, to bring to it. Thankfully, we have this immensely alive in this scene that is doing that. But I always say, like, be ambitious. Be ambitious, not necessarily towards your future prospects or what you want your life to be, but just about what you want your game to be, because there you can sometimes again do a game because I don't know, you want to say that you have made a game, or you want to get a different type of jobs, or you want to be famous, or horrible reasons like that. And instead just do it for that, but in everything from interface, because again, everything in games, from the way we tell stories to the way we show them to the way we show interfaces, is absolutely undeveloped. It's at the, how do you say, albori della civiltà in English?
Well, it's still in early days, kind of.
It's still in early days. Yeah. It always reminds me, like I say, like when comics were at the beginning, with like where comics were decades ago, and then they grew up to be so much. We're growing in a more interesting way and faster than comics were, and I'm absolutely not talking about AAA, but only about indies. Because there were no indie comics basically at the beginning of comics history, not like we have in games, while now there are a lot. So yes, be ambitious. La la la.
Okay, Jesse, if you got anything else.
I don't have anything. I think we've probably been cancelled by this point. I mean,
again, well, it's at this point, I know it's becoming a habit.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to talk about fascists for once. I'm so sorry that I went into that. Also because that was a very simplistic point, so it didn't really deliver the message, and
it didn't explore the complexity of the topic of fascism and fascists.
I mean, the biggest thing is I'm sitting here thinking, like, we could talk about fascism, and then I'm like, but this is not a podcast about that,